Okay, so I'll just start by introducing the panel or the two-panel stream, and there might be a few other people who join us before we actually start the presentations. My name is Lindsay Whitfield. I'm a professor with special responsibilities at Roskilde University in Denmark, and I have organized this panel together with Tobias Woodke, who will be presenting a paper on the first panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. So this was very much an idea that came us working together, and is also the central theme of Tobias's PhD, which he has just started. But as the blurb says, you know, the 20th century has seen a number of countries go through significant industrialization experiences. And even though the Latin American late industrializers fell short of their East Asian counterparts' achievements, they still recorded significant increases in manufacturing output and even in manufacturing exports, at least until the early 1980s. Import substitution and government intervention have been part of all these industrialization experiences, both in Latin America and East Asia. ISI policies created the necessary space for domestic firms to undertake industrial production and learning. And thus, there is a significant body of literature that has discussed what originally emerged as a division, largely promoted by the World Bank, a division between import substitution industrialization, or industrial policies aimed at promoting import substitution industrialization, versus an industrialization strategy that was export-oriented, and thus industrial policies aimed at promoting export-oriented industrialization, and that was characterized by either or. And that Latin American and other countries that did ISI, also including a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, failed, particularly after economic and trade liberalization, because they had pursued ISI. And East Asian countries did better because they had pursued export-oriented industrial policies. But we can now see that this dichotomy was a false dichotomy, and that both of these countries or regions pursued a mix of ISI and export-oriented industrialization. So what we want to do in this panel is to move beyond this dichotomy, to dig deeper into these industrialization experiences and analyze how ISI and EOI policies actually work together, with a focus on stimulating locally owned firms and global firms, in order to think about how industrial policy should be designed in the 21st century. And then added to that is the rising debate around how to rethink industrial policy in the context of the pervasiveness of global value chains, that exporting necessarily means entering global value chains, or what the literature has increasingly called vertical specialization industrialization. So you can add another acronym up there. We have VSI. So the panel wants to explore how developing country governments can facilitate domestic learning for productivity, meaning increasing the technological capabilities of locally owned firms in a world of vertically integrated specialization or global value chains. And the papers in both of these panels today explore recent experiences of developing countries with industrial policy and manufacturing, agribusiness, and knowledge-based services, with a focus on how governments navigate the challenges of VSI, EOI, and ISI. Lots of acronyms up there. So today's panel one, the presenters are already on the stage. I'll introduce them in the order that they will present. But before I do that, let me just say a few things for those of you who have not been part of a panel in the virtual conference yet. You ask questions with the question button. We have decided to take all three presentations first, and then each presenter has 15 minutes, so that should leave an hour for question, answer, and a broader discussion on these issues, especially since most of us, many of us know each other already, have read each other's work, and have already been engaging in these conversations. But you can enter the questions as we go. I will be the main administrator as well as the chair of this panel. I will not publish the questions until we enter the question and answer session, but I will see them as they come up. I would ask that when you type the question, you indicate if it's for a particular presenter or if it's for the panel as a whole. I think that's it for the technical issues. So let me introduce the speakers. First, we have Tobias Woodke, who's a PhD candidate at Roskilde University, and he will be presenting the lessons from the 20th century are still relevant industrial policy for catch-up industrialization in today's global production system. Jostein Hage, who I'll let actually introduce his current title. I know he's at Cambridge. Industrial policy in the era of global value chains towards a developmentalist framework drawing on the industrialization experiences of South Korea and Taiwan. And Michael Odigi, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and his paper title, who's also at Cambridge, is traditional industrial policy defunct? Evidence from the Nigerian cement industry. And I should say that what Jostein and Michael are going to present are actually published articles, and we have all been reading them, and we're actually interested in having a quite significant debate, as people will take slightly different stances on these issues. So it should be very interesting. So let's start with Tobias. I will take Michael and Jostein down.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay, for the introduction. As she has introduced, I'm doing a PhD at Roskilde University, and the PhD is actually on the automotive industry in South Africa, and the industrial policy and what that industrial policy in the last 25 years has meant for the structure of the industry, linkages domestically, and ownership structures. But the presentation that I'm giving today is a summary of a paper that has come out of a literature review that I've conducted for this PhD. And maybe you can just go to the next slide, Lindsay. And it was inspired by this sentence in a piece by Giraffe and Sturgeon, and which is actually mentioned in a lot of other papers in the GVC literature, arguing that there can be no return to the ISI and EOI policies of old, referring to what Latin American countries and East Asian countries and also some sub-Saharan African countries did in the last century. So that, taking this as inspiration, I wanted to look at the literature on these actual old ISI and EOI policies, and then look at the changed global production systems, so the emergence of global value chains, and what this means for the application of these old policies, and whether it's really true that they cannot be applied anymore. And taking these two strands of the literature, first of all, the slightly older literature on the ISI and EOI policies, and then look at these policies through the lens of today's global production system, which is dominated by global value chains, and to then infer from that implications for what industrial policy should look like in the 21st century. So next slide, please. I have selected some issues that I think are core lessons from this literature review on the old policies. There are many more lessons in the paper, but because of time, I will focus on 3 lessons that I think are especially relevant when we look at how the global production system has changed and how GVC-led industrialization might be limited and what can be done about it. So first, as Lindsay said in the introduction, ISI and EOI policies were actually present in the success cases and in the failures. So it's not to argue that the Latin American experience was only inward-looking and the East Asian experience was only outward-looking. That misses a lot of nuance. So what I want to emphasize, what is actually visible in the literature, is that ISI and EOI policies were used hand in hand and in 2 ways. First of all, in sequence, that is kind of well known that, and especially in East Asia, after the first phase of input substitution, there was a phase of export-oriented industrialization. And this phase of export-oriented industrialization actually provided the foreign exchange to sustain further import substitution. And it also created the demand for intermediate goods domestically, because these export industries had demand for intermediate goods, and these industries could then be subject of further import substitution. So instead of importing these intermediate goods, having them produced domestically. So it's about a sequence. EOI provided the push for the second ISI phase, whereas in Latin America, the direct transition from ISI 1 to ISI 2, as it's called in the literature, missed out in a lot of these dynamics. But then a second point, and I think Jostein is going to elaborate on that in more detail, is that ISI and EOI policies were actually used hand in hand, especially in South Korea and Taiwan, where they had different policies for different sectors, so more protective policies for domestically important industries and more liberal policies for industries or sectors that were dependent on imported inputs. So really nuanced allocation of policies to different sectors dependent on their needs. But also there's a lot of evidence of, for example, protection being used as compensation for firms that moved into exporting and that incurred losses in the beginning. So they were actually compensated for these losses by being protected on the domestic market. But as I said, I think Jostein is going to talk about that in more detail. The second point I want to emphasize is the importance of domestic ownership, because ownership agnostic interpretations of productive capability building and learning are insufficient. If we only look at productive capabilities in an industry independent of ownership, we miss out on understanding actually how important domestic ownership is. And there's this little book by Alice Amsden and Chu on Taiwan from 2003, where they show actually the importance of domestic ownership and what it means for the buildup of a local knowledge and production system. And the counterexample is the Latin American experience, where learning was completely or almost completely dominated by multinational corporations. And then the last point, domestic market dynamics and domestic integration. So South Korea's and Taiwan's success was actually all about domestic integration of the export industries, backward integration. So it's important to keep this in mind and not just to focus on exporting and outward orientation. And the domestic market is also more relevant, or was more relevant in these experiences than is often acknowledged. If we look at South Korea, for example, 70% of manufacturing output growth between 1955 and 1975, according to a World Bank study, was due to domestic demand expansion in a period when export growth was really relevant. And we can also see how it's linked here, because domestic demand does not only mean domestic demand for consumer goods, it also means domestic demand for the intermediate goods. So, and that is driven by the export industries that are actually backward integrating in the domestic economy and demanding these type of goods. So next slide, please. What I want to focus on now is moving from these lessons, these core lessons, to what has changed in the global production system, and how is GVC integration as an industrialization strategy too limited maybe today. So it is often argued in the GVC literature that the buildup of fully domestically integrated industries is no longer possible. And if we look at especially the East Asian experience, that is a severe downside, because the East Asian experience was totally built on domestic integration, as I've said before. So if global value chain integration now means to just that developing country firms engage in niche activities, that will not create the same boost to domestic demand for intermediate goods that was created by the buildup of fully integrated industries in the past. Then a second point is a delocalization of supplier industries under global value chain integration. That's actually something we see in a lot of global value chains. And the case I'm most familiar with, the automotive industry, it's definitely a feature of global value chain integration that local content often decreases the more you integrate with the global value chain. So these are the phenomena of follow sourcing and follow design that are well documented in the GVC literature. Then the next point of limited domestic linkages, it's kind of related to that, but also limited technology spillovers. And the last point I think is especially important when comparing today with the time in which Korea and Taiwan made their biggest advances, is that in South Korea and Taiwan, the export surplus was actually domestically redistributed through a very egalitarian income distribution and through this demand for intermediate goods from the export industries that then industrial policy managed to channel into import substitution and into domestic linkages. And the question is that still possible today to reap these or to get this value from exporting? And I think there's a lot of evidence that it's severely limited. For example, the dominance of intellectual property rights by firms from developed countries. So it's very difficult for developing country firms to move into higher value added activities. That's the whole smile curve discussion. Then also the supplier squeeze, there's evidence for supplier squeeze in a lot of different global value chains. And there's also evidence for wage suppression in global value chains. And I think all of these different pieces of evidence that are kind of interlinked show that there are limited opportunities for value capture in GVC-led industrialization. Next slide, please. But there are also reasons for optimism in the sense that GVCs are different and not deterministic, and especially if one takes a look at industrialization strategies that incorporate integration in global value chains, but that also move beyond that. So there are actually in more recent literature some examples of successful domestic integration, increased local content, and also domestic ownership of firms that stay or become world leaders. So, for example, if we look at the literature, for example, from Brazil on the footwear and furniture industries, but also a paper on China by Giraud and Poncet, I think it becomes evident that FDI and exposure to the technological frontier are a necessary condition, but they are not a sufficient condition. The sufficient condition for actually having more domestic integration and domestic ownership is that the domestic firms are able to absorb this technology that is present in the country, and that they move from domestic and regional markets to global markets. And I think this is interesting because throughout this literature, you see that it's the domestic firms and not that are first of all serving the domestic and regional markets, and then gain from this technology spillover and move to the global markets. And it's often not the firms that start out, that are foreign owned and start out as heavy exporters, that then later move to the domestic or regional market. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the domestic firms and to facilitate these spillovers with industrial policy. Next slide, please. So in a way, this literature review is kind of setting the stage for the two presentations that are going to follow. But I think just to say that enter global value chains and upgrade in global value chains as industrial policy advice is not enough. And there are several more recent pieces in the literature, including the one by Jostin, that also argues that it's about strategic and selective integration with global value chains. So developing country governments should think about what different sectors and different market trajectories, so domestic market, regional value chains, global value chains, what they can actually deliver for the process of catch-up industrialization, instead of just thinking in terms of let's enter the global value chain and upgrade and have that as the only focus. The focus on domestic ownership and domestic integration, which was the essence of the East Asian success story, should not be lost. There's also some indicative evidence that global value chains deliver product and process upgrading, while regional value chains and the domestic market are more capable or have more potential for functional upgrading. More recent literature on regional value chains, for example, emphasizes that. Also, the demand side really matters, especially if we keep in mind how important the domestic market is. The egalitarian income distribution in South Korea, Taiwan, China, as opposed to the very unequal income distribution in Latin America was an important advantage. So policies should also try to, maybe through public procurement or other kind of policies to support the demand side and not just focus on the supply side. And the last point I want to make is that I don't agree with the point that the ISI policies of old are completely irrelevant. Of course, they have to be much more nuanced in a world of global value chains where you have to import inputs, and that should be quite liberalized. But in industries that are less integrated with global value chains, I think it's still possible to implement import substitution policies. And Michael's paper that is coming up on the Nigerian cement industry is a good example of that. So seeing that Lindsay is coming up, I think I'm out of time. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tobias. So I've now brought Michael up. I'll let him introduce himself for a few seconds while I pull up the slides.
So thank you very much. This presentation, as well as the broader research on which it is based, is basically conceived as a pushback against the view that traditional industrial policy, or rather industrial policy as understood before the 1980s, that is building of a complete production chain, is no longer relevant. As we know, industrial policy has to do with production. And the way production is currently structured in the modern sense, as explained through theories like global value chain, global production network, it's spatially fragmented. Therefore, the argument goes, industrial policy must take this spatial fragmentation into account, and therefore traditional industrial policy, or the idea of building a complete production chain within the borders of any given country, it's no longer relevant. Next slide, please. So my work is basically structured as a pushback against this. In reference to cement production in Nigeria as well as other African countries, I'm just proposing the argument that traditional industrial policy or building full production chain is still relevant. So what I'm going to do in this short presentation, the first part would touch on some of the shortcomings of global value chain oriented industrial policy. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining global value chain oriented industrial policy because I think the first presenter did some of that, and I think Justine will do some of that too. So I'll just go directly to show some of the shortcomings in the first part. Then in the second part, I would propose a two-step understanding of industrial strategy. This is in reference to Africa. Then the third part, I would show an example of this two-stage industrial strategy with reference to cement production in Nigeria, and I also touch on Morocco, maybe Senegal, and Cameroon. Then the fourth part would conclude. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, these are some of the shortcomings. No, go back. Yeah. These are, I think, some of the shortcomings of global value chain oriented industrial policy from African perspective. So the first problem is one of historical background. There are two problems here. One, what is the real history of GVC? Justine in his paper argued, I think convincingly, that both South Korea and Taiwan employed global value chain oriented industrial policy as far back as 1960s. There's a French scholar whose name I just forgot now, who recently made the argument that in light of what we now understand as GVC, it is relevant to restudy the industrial process of Japan before the Second World War, of England in the 19th century, of these European countries. It is possible that they also employed global value chain, something that could be called global value chain oriented industrial policy. This is his argument. But the main problem from the African perspective is that the the colonial economic restructuring that occurred in Africa, I think, fits this language of global value chain oriented industrial policy in a very broad sense. If you consider, so in my article, I gave the example of cotton production in Cote d'Ivoire as well as in French West Africa. How the Cotton Producers Association in France in the early 20th century came together with the French colonial office to promote a specific uh, um, to promote a specific cotton variety which colonial countries have to cultivate because they need this as raw material. Now, this may not fit into the language of global value chain today, but I think it does because these firms were lead firms in so many ways, and they were basically, they've basically forced these African countries to adopt these crops, this variety of cotton because they needed this for their textile production. The reason why I think the colonial history tells us so much about global value chain in reference to Africa is when we start discussing issues of linkages. I'll come back to that. So the real problem number two is that most African countries are currently disadvantaged. They are clearly disadvantaged in GVC participation. The reason for this is because they have low skills, low standard, a poor business environment, weak infrastructure, and so on. However, traditional industrial policy, ISI, is one way of solving some of these problems, of increasing the skill level, increasing the standard, even the business environment. And the third problem, I think, with the third shortcoming of GVC-oriented industrial policy, which the previous speaker touched on, is that some of the advantages of industrialization as we know them are not accessible through GVC-oriented industrial policy. Um, I mean, in my work, I argue that not just linkage with domestic circumstances, whether it's infrastructural linkage, whether it's input linkage, production linkage, for example, nearby products, you can't assess this through a strict global value chain oriented industrial policy. You need local ownership, at least historically, and a link between production and domestic markets to assess some of these linkages. So the fourth shortcoming, I think, of global value chain oriented industrial policy from the African perspective is the need to build domestic lead firms. And the previous presenter touched on this a little. Um, if anything, the expansion of global value chains have been accompanied by a massive expansion and consolidation of powerful lead firms, of power in the hands of lead firms. And there's very little part in setting production chains from niche specialization to becoming a lead firm or to creating a lead firm. Um, the easiest way of creating lead firms is through ISI, through building domestic food industries in the first step. The second step of export, then they can then move to become to they can then become lead firms. So next slide. On on the basis of this shortcoming, in my article, I propose a two-stage or two-step understanding of industrial policy. I agree that this does not apply or should not apply to all sectors, but it should apply to some sectors. The question is, which of the sectors? How do we distinguish between the sectors to pursue pure GVC and the ones to pursue ISI? So stage one in my conception of two-stage industrial strategy would be to construct a complete supply chain within the borders of a given country. That's traditional industrial policy for three reasons. One would be to attain the skills to reach the standard necessary to participate in high value GVC. Second would be to reap the benefit of traditional industrial policy that are absent from global value chain oriented industrial policy, such as linkages, different types of linkages, especially infrastructural linkages if we're talking about Africa. Then the third would be to build domestic lead firms. So after this stage one, stage two then becomes participating or joining lead firm, joining global value chain. Then African countries can then negotiate with foreign investments in better terms. Next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide. So as an example of this two-step conception of industrial policy, I studied cement production in Africa. Why cement? Cement for three reasons. One, there's domestic demand in all African countries for cement. Number two, there is production policies in most African countries for cement production. And number three, there are examples of African countries that started with global value chain oriented industrial policy in cement and others that started with traditional industrial policy. So it's easy to compare both. So in the case of Nigeria, which is my main case study, in 2002, the government created a backward integration policy, which is which is as traditional as the policy can get. They banned importation of cement and gave out incentive to domestic producers, provided they employ domestic labor, use domestic raw material, and sell to domestic market, and so on and so forth. So the main part of this story is that the cement production in Nigeria increased from 1.5 million tons in 2003, 2004 to now about roughly 28, 29 million tons. Nigeria is currently, I think, one of the biggest producers of cement in Africa. That's just the main part of the story. But the real part of the story, in reference to GVC, is that this industrial policy led to one, an increase in skills standards, created so many linkages, infrastructure linkages. There's no time to get into this. So many production linkages, nearby products. I'm currently researching on sugar production. Most of the cement producers are also producing sugar, and to them, I've not been able to find the link, but they have argued directly to me and my co-researchers that there is a direct link between producing cement and producing sugar. Not the not the raw sugar production, but the refinery part of it. This is one of the production linkages. There are input linkages. Um, so this places Nigeria in a better position to negotiate with foreign firms. Currently, there are some cement companies, I think one German company trying to get into Nigeria now using global value chain as the structure of getting in. Nigeria is now in a better position to negotiate with that foreign capital because they have the right skill, the right standard, the right infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But it's not just Nigeria. Next slide, please. So the process of building the process of building the process of this ISI in Nigeria led to not just one but a couple of Nigeria domestic lead firms. So this is Dangote. Dangote is the biggest producer of cement in Nigeria. It's currently, I think, in 12 African countries. Dangote is now a lead firm. So it's not as if we're just the country is now simply just receiving foreign investment. It is also now a foreign investor. So Dangote is currently, I think, in 13 African, 12 to 13. From next month, it will be 13 African countries using global value chain strategy to get into most of these countries. Nigeria is not alone, it's not unique in this case. Another fitting example is Morocco. So in 2007, the government of Morocco signed an investment agreement with a domestic businessman to produce cement. This led to CIMAT, CIMAT. When Morocco became self-sufficient, they started exporting cement. Next slide, please. And CIMAT currently, it's an international lead firm. It's currently, I think, in 11 African countries. This is a map of the map of CIMAT in Africa. So they have a full domestic production chain in Morocco, whereas in other African countries, it's GVC strategy. And there are French cement companies in Morocco using GVC strategy. So Morocco currently is in a better position to negotiate with foreign capital, and they also have a domestic lead firm. The flip side of that, I think Ethiopia, by the way, fit into this Nigerian Morocco's structure a little. The flip side of that is a country like Cameroon or even Senegal that pursued a GVC policy from the get-go. If you study the part, even though they have raw material in Cameroon, if you study the pattern of linkages in Cameroon, they've not been able to even exploit the raw material because it is cheaper for the foreign firms. They currently have 5 different foreign companies in Cameroon, including Dangote and CIMAF. These foreign firms have not been able to develop the domestic raw material in Cameroon because it is more expensive for them. It is easier for them to just import raw materials. Dangote is currently importing raw material, not just from Nigeria, but from the Middle East, because it is cheaper than to help Cameroon in developing its own raw material. So Cameroon fits into that. Another example that fits into that, I think, is Senegal. Senegal have huge limestone deposits, but they follow the GVC as opposed to ISI strategy from the beginning. This means two different French companies came in. Dangote came in. These companies have their own strategy in mind. Instead of helping the country to develop domestic linkages and domestic how shall I put it? To help the country to develop their domestic raw material. Some of these firms are actually importing raw material from outside. They are just basically they're basically importing raw material from outside, and they have access to domestic market, and as a result.
That's okay, Michael. You can just take a few, 30 seconds to wrap up.
Yeah. So the point I was making, I'm not therefore saying that in every single sector, this two-step understanding of industrial policy should apply. The main question is, in certain sectors, especially in sectors for which there is a huge domestic market, I think it is better for African countries to, first of all, create domestic lead firms, domestic production. Try to link the domestic production to domestic consumption before moving towards a global value chain strategy.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Perfect. Yes, so first of all, big thanks to Lindsay and Tobias for organizing this panel and also a panel this afternoon that hosts some great scholars on industrial policy. So I'm presenting a paper that was recently published in a journal called World Economy entitled Industrial Policy in the Era of Global Value Chains towards a developmentalist framework drawing on the industrialization experiences of South Korea and Taiwan. Next slide, please. So the motivation, this is research I've done for a few years now, and the motivation for the paper I wrote was a paper I read a few years ago by Milberg, Yang, and Gireffi, a quote which I put on the slide here. And what I'd like for you to note is what I've highlighted in bold, saying that industrial policy viewed through the lens of global value chains will differ from traditional arguments of industrial policy. And the paper as a whole is about how, sort of in this new era of expansion of global value chains, industrial policy has to differ from traditional arguments for industrial policy. So I thought if I'm able to say anything, I'm just going to do a few changes on my screen here. There we go. If I'm able to say anything about the continued relevance of traditional, or what they call traditional industrial policy in this era of global value chain expansion, I've said something useful. Next slide, please. So I have a section of my paper where I go through the so-called global value chain perspective and the so-called developmentalist perspective. And I put them in scare quotes because they don't necessarily make complete sense as sort of boxed or delimited theoretical streams or schools of thought. These are both perspectives or theories, if you will, that are in the field of development studies, interested in the processes of economic development through industrialization. And in the global value chain perspective, the term industrial upgrading is used more. The difference between these two perspectives, however, is that the global value chain perspective focuses on firms and the international organization of industries, while the developmentalist perspective, building on Kuznets, Arthur Lewis, and so on, focuses more on the role of the state and industrial policy and has a stronger grounding in historical experiences in this regard. Now, in recent years, we've seen scholars who work on global value chains and who identify a bit more around this perspective, focusing more on the role of the state. And we've also seen contributions from scholars combining these two perspectives, including Michael, Lindsay. We also have Antonio, who's presenting this afternoon, Pritish Bahuria. So there's an emerging literature that sort of combine these streams, two streams of perspectives, to incorporate more the role of the state in formulating policy in the era of global value chains. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these new principles of industrial policy as proposed by the global value chain framework. And I should emphasize here that the literature that I've reviewed for this paper is not exhaustive of the entire global value chain literature. It focuses specifically on those that write about industrial policy, and largely Gary Gireffi here. You could criticize me for somewhat omitting global production networks literature, which is certainly relevant for understanding industrialization, industrial upgrading, and the role of the state. But there haven't been that many that explicitly tackle this question of industrial policy and the traditional literature on industrial policy. Okay, so I'll go through the tenets now. So next annotation, please. So first of all, the GVC perspective calls for a new industrial policy that shifts its stance from aiming to develop fully integrated production to a stance focusing on specialized tasks within industries. This is something that throughout the previous presentations, I think we've covered. Basically, the argument is that in the old days, building full-fledged domestic, vertically integrated industries was more important than today, when it's more important to sort of specialize in a niche of an industry, a specific task of an industry, also sometimes known as vertical integration or vertically specialized industrialization, VSI. I think Lindsay introduced this term. Next point, please. And the second point focuses more on linking up to transnational corporations. It's obviously linked to the first point, because normally specializing within a niche or a task of an industry means that you somehow link up to an existing global value chain and also maybe foreign investment into your host economy. But the point here is that transnational corporations have gained a much more prominent role in the economic development of catch-up economies, and linking up to these corporations and also attracting FDI has become a more central economic development strategy for many developing countries and catch-up economies. Next point, please. And then here's the third point, highly critical to the use of import substitution industrialization strategies, ISI. For those of you who don't know exactly what ISI is, I think the best or the easiest way to think about this is protectionist policies for the purpose of building domestic capabilities and sort of seeing the emergence of domestic firms. Now, I should probably mention that I had an email exchange with Gary Gireffi after the publication of my paper, and we had a useful discussion about it, and he seemed to like it, but the one sort of thing he was a bit critical about was the fact that I was critical of the review of ISI strategies by the GVC perspective. So in my paper, I claim that there is a very clear dichotomy between export-oriented industrialization and import substitution industrialization in the GVC perspective. And this perspective claims that export-oriented industrialization has been more successful. Gireffi pointed out that he has some previous literature in the 80s and also the early 90s that recognizes the intricate balance between these two strategies and also the importance of import substitution industrialization strategies in successful industrialization experiences in East Asia. My point or my sort of rebuttal to this was that you're probably right, I could have recognized this early literature a bit better. However, in the recent decade, which is sort of the era where we've seen the label GVCs becoming more common, and also where we've seen this expansion of global value chains, this literature is not brought forth. So if you want to really go deep into the GVC literature, I should say that there are some early articles in the 80s and 90s before it became the GVC literature that recognizes ISI strategies, especially from Gireffi. Next slide, please. So why did I focus on South Korea and Taiwan in this paper? The first point is, and that relates to my first slide, can I say anything about the relevance of global value chain oriented industrial policy in these countries' industrialization experiences? Most of the literature on global value chains today doesn't focus on late 20th century or post-World War II development experiences. So if I could say something useful about the relevance of global value chains to these countries, I felt like I'd already made somewhat of a contribution. Next point, please. Obviously, another reason for choosing them is that they've been two of the most successful examples of late industrialization throughout the history of capitalism. And I would argue less idiosyncratic than, say, Hong Kong and Singapore. South Korea and Taiwan had larger populations. They also started their industrialization experiences from an agrarian base, which I would contend hold more relevance for a lot of catch-up experiences today, especially in Africa. So if I wanted to use two countries to sort of hold lessons for today's developing countries, these were two countries that were interesting to look at. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of all the global value chain oriented industrial policies that South Korea and Taiwan implemented. You can read the paper if you want the details on that. But I will say briefly that global value chains were important to these countries' industrialization experiences, probably not as central as some developing countries today, probably not as central as, for example, China's industrialization experiences. But they attracted foreign investors from both the US and Japan, in Korea's case, participating in value chains with lead firms from Japan was important, especially in the textile industry. In Taiwan, the electronics industry, attracting investors from both Japan and the US. Now, the key point I make in the paper is that these countries bargained with foreign investors to ensure technology transfer and growth of local content in exports. They didn't simply invite investors, they didn't create lucrative incentives or hand out subsidies or only tax incentives to these investors. They bargained with them heavily to achieve the outcomes that they wanted, which is not that common today. And the measures they mainly used were joint venture requirements and local content requirements. Next slide, please. Another point I make is that they applied an intricate balance between export-oriented industrialization and import substitution industrialization. Export orientation is something that a lot of scholars agree should be a focus of industrialization experiences today. And that also had an unequivocal green light in Korea and Taiwan. Import substitution was a bit more tricky. Some imports were needed or were necessary to feed the export strategy. But also the countries had to be careful not to rely too heavy on imports for two reasons, mainly. One is obviously balancing the trade balance, the balance of payments and foreign exchange scarcity, and also nurturing domestic firms, right? The large idea of import substitution industrialization is to give some space for domestic firms to grow, and in the era of global value chains, or in the context of global value chains, to serve perhaps as suppliers to foreign firms. Now, reciprocal control mechanisms, which is the term introduced by Alice Amstons, were crucial in both instances. So the idea of a reciprocal control mechanism is basically handing out a favor, often in the form of a subsidy or a tax write-off, in return for some performance target achieved by a firm. So the government then hands out these favors. So subsidies were handed out in return for performance, which could be reaching a certain volume of exports or export at a certain volume on the technological frontier, or to compensate suffering imports. So the government sometimes forced firms to use, some domestic firms to use other domestic inputs, but then they would give them financial incentives in return for doing so. Next slide, please. Now, in the end of the paper, I propose a framework which I call a GVC sort of developmentalist nexus, where I combine ideas from both framework, or rather where I sort of build on this quite useful framework proposed by Jaffe and Milberg and Sturgeon and others, but sort of add on to it a few ideas from what I call the developmentalist framework. And the first point is the degree of state intervention in balancing trade openness and protectionism. So both perspectives highlight the importance of policies to build domestic capacity and local content. And some people might tell you that the GVC perspective does not highlight domestic capacity enough. I think they highlight it very, very carefully. Thank you. But the developmentalist perspective highlights a tougher stance on foreign investors. If you read some of the articles I cite in my paper, you'll see that, for example, some of these World Bank publications say that industrial policy should only be used light-handedly, or that developing countries had to be very careful not to scare off foreign investors. This is somewhat different from what South Korea and Taiwan did. And also the developmentalist perspective shows more clearly how industrialization cannot work without some protectionist measures. Next slide, please. I'll go quickly through this point. So this is a point about linking up to transnational corporations or competing against them. So this curve is basically showing how certain manufacturing activities in the 21st century have become less profitable compared to the 1970s. And the idea here is that, as some of you probably are familiar with, this argument that by inserting oneself or one's firms into a global value chain, there's a risk of being stuck with carrying out low value activities. And the argument I'm trying to make here is, well, this discourse on establishing state-owned enterprises, which was much more prominent in the developmentalist literature, and that hasn't properly been acknowledged, I think, in the global value chain literature. The importance of state-owned enterprises for economic development, right? For taking on risk that private firms can take, for having strategic control over industries. If we look empirically today at the prominence of state-owned enterprises in catch-up experiences, it's very, very clear. I think over 50,000 firms in China are either partly or fully owned by the state. And you have lots of examples of important and successful state-owned enterprises in Brazil today, and obviously in South Korea and Taiwan during their development experiences. I advise you to read a paper by Rory Horner and Matthew Alford on the role of the state in global value chains, where they actually acknowledge that state-owned enterprises haven't been given enough attention in the global value chain literature. Next slide. So this is the last point I want to make, and I'm going to wrap up with this point. This is perhaps something that could be interesting to discuss more in the discussion section. Why should we bother taking lessons from a time when things were different? There are a lot of things we can focus on here. Due to the nature of global trade agreements today, is it as easy for countries to industrialize and apply the same policies that South Korea and Taiwan did, such as local content requirements, such as joint venture requirements, do international trade agreements, and especially trade agreements through WTO membership, allow for these things? We can also talk about, given the increased global competition between developing countries today, is there the same space for being as tough on foreign investors? If you now put requirements, or if you now sort of give certain conditions on foreign investors to invest in your host economy, couldn't they just go to another low-cost country if their motivation is in the first instance to save labor costs for coming to your country, right? Or we can talk about, were the conditions for industrialization in Korea and Taiwan somewhat different? Did they have an advantage because of geopolitics at the time, the importance of US aid? The legacy of Japanese colonialism is sometimes also highlighted in the literature. I discussed some of these things in the paper, but I thought it could also be fun if we were able to discuss these questions during the discussion session. Okay, so that's it from me.
By Nikolai Schultz, who said he doesn't need to come to the podium, is for Michael. Why is it easier to import semen to Cameroon? Oh, where does it go? There it goes again. Why is it easier to import semen to Cameroon, Senegal than develop the local industry? Also, given that Dangote appears to develop semen industries across the continent. Just one second. Sally, do you know if it's possible to get the question to stay up longer? Michael, did you get the question?
Yes, I did.
So you can go ahead and answer while we see if we can organize.
The raw material for making cement, it's I think limestone. Cameroon does have a huge deposit of limestone. However, the circumstances of the deposit is of the nature that it will be very difficult to exploit the limestone because it's very close to a river. And so it is easier for a firm like Dangote to export clinker, not so much cement. Clinker as semi-processed cement. They have to process them further from either from Nigeria or from the Middle East, because some cement industries, I think, there was even a time it was imported from Pakistan. Okay, I think they have subsidized cement there, so it's easier for him to just import from there and then process further. He was even doing the same thing in Ghana. So he has a processing plant in Ghana. So he would import from third country, process, and then sell to domestic market. Yeah, I mean, it is easier for him because it would be more difficult to develop the specific raw material that they have in Cameroon, the specific limestone that they have in Cameroon. We have limestone in Nigeria. He's developing that, but it's easier sometimes to import from a third country as opposed to either from Nigeria or developing Cameroon's raw material. I don't know if that answers the question.
Nikolai, if it doesn't, you can just turn on your mic and, oh no, you can't. I have to bring you to the podium, sorry. So let's leave it for there now. If he has a follow-up question, he can write it in, or if he wants to come to the podium, just you can write that. I see there's a raised hand. I'm not quite sure. So I think Raja might want to come. So there's more questions specifically to Michael from Raja. So I'm gonna post that one.
Okay.
And then possibly bring Raja up if I take myself down. So what were the reciprocal control mechanisms in the case of Dangote?
Okay. Yeah, there were so many reciprocal control mechanisms. He was, when the policy was created in 2002, Nigeria still dependent. The country basically was importing 75% of domestic consumption. One of the requirements was for Dangote to start developing, to start investing in domestic production. And government officials once in a year would visit his factory to be sure he's actually investing in domestic production of cement. And they created a chart once in every December to check how far he has gone. So they gave him 5 years from 2002 to start selling domestic produced cement to domestic markets. After 5 years, he wasn't actually. After 5 years, it took a very long time for the investment to materialize. So after 5 years, in 2007, 2008, there was actually an attempt by the federal government to give out more licenses, more import licenses. So he became angry. He started promoting the policy he started saying he needed just 2-3 more years. So the main mechanism was for him to start selling cement, domestically produced cement, within a period of 5 years. But it took him, I think, about 7-8 years to start selling cement, domestically produced cement to domestic market. I don't know if that makes any sense. So
Yeah, it does. I was trying to link the previous question because I think that's often the case in Africa, where it's the when you're trying to connect the GVC with the developmentist literature. It's like,
yeah.
what are the specific cases where where there have been reciprocal control mechanisms, and whether the governments have actually been able to enforce them?
Yeah, the government actually did enforce them, but I think in Dangote there was an active attempt to create domestic production of cement, regardless of the reciprocal mechanisms, because he was not the only. Dangote cement factory was not the only domestic cement granted the advantages. There were a couple of cement. There's Ibeto cement, there's BUA cement, but I think he had a firm strategy on his part, regardless of the industrial policy, or I think was aided by the industrial policy, because he was, in so many ways, he was the one that influenced the industrial policy. So it was sector specific, but it was also firm specific in so many ways. So he benefited more than the other domestic cement producers, and he also had, I think, a vision, regardless of the industrial policy, to produce domestic cement. He wanted to produce and control the market. So I would say why there were so many mechanisms on the part of the government to hold him to account. There was an active attempt on his part to develop domestic production of cement. I don't know if that makes any sense. And I think one of the
It's
reasons
actually my paper tomorrow focuses more on kind of entrepreneur vision. So
I think one of the
interesting to
reasons
see.
for that was because cement is very capital intensive. So within the first 4 or 5 years of the policy, he spent so much. So he had to work very hard to see that the policy became successful in so many ways. Because he spent, I think he had to borrow almost $300 million. So it's difficult for him to walk back from that. So why there was government mechanism to hold him to account, it was on his part an attempt, a firm strategy to develop cement production in Nigeria. So I don't think just the reciprocal mechanism is enough, because Nigeria is a very corrupt country and he can manipulate one or two. Okay.
Sorry, we have a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna post. Tobias, Nikolai asked, from your reading, what is seen as the main reason why some countries in the global south decided to sequence correctly or not? What do you think?
Okay, yeah, I think also going back to the last question, the Nigerian case is really interesting, and to also discuss why it only worked in cement and in basically no other sector to any substantial extent would be an interesting discussion, because there are similar policies in place, but they're just not working in the same way that did in the cement industry. So to the question that has gone again, but I think I remember it. So I think there's a link to what Jostein said earlier, that Giraffe was kind of complaining that his old literature is not taken into account. So there's a book by him in 1990 on, it's called Manufacturing Miracles. And there he elaborates on this point, the difference between, and also the other contributions in that book, on the difference between East Asia and Latin America. And I mean, he acknowledges that there is a difference in sequencing, but what I think is not really acknowledged in those contributions is the complementary way it was also used. But it's interesting to go back to that book, because there are other contributions in that book that actually discuss the political economy in Latin America. So then in that sense, it's more about politics, like the strength of the landed elites, the bigger domestic markets that made import substitution more durable. So I think those are definitely political reasons that are documented in the literature. But ideas, I think, still matter. For example, today in the case of Nigeria, for example, this anti-export bias that you often find in a lot of inward-looking policies made in Nigeria. I think when these ideas are dominant, that first of all, my reaction was, okay, interesting that somebody is looking at the domestic market and trying to enforce more inward-looking policies. But actually, if you completely neglect exporting, that is also not a sustainable strategy. So yeah, ideas matter.
Okay, so I'm trying to also go through let the audience get some time in before the panel. So maybe panel members, you can keep your ideas written down and come in later, so I can go through the specific questions first. I'm trying to do ones that are linked to themes and that cover different people. So Sebastian Heinen at SOAS asked Jostein, and it kind of links to the politics, so I'm doing the political ones. What about the particular political economy in South Korea and Taiwan that allowed reciprocal control mechanisms to be enforced? Maybe you want to say a little bit about that, and then is the situation different? One more time. Sorry, I'm just figuring out how to keep the questions up longer. Go ahead, Jostein.
This is a very good question, and also a very, very big question that will be asked, have been asked for years, and will be asked for years. Obviously, the political economic conditions in South Korea and Taiwan were unique, as they are to many countries. There is a literature on sort of developmental states that emerged from the East Asian development experience that talk about a bit about the role of authoritarianism, but also a bit about the role of this concept of embedded autonomy introduced by Peter Evans, which is sort of a very capable bureaucracy that is a partner with the private sector, but yet is sort of kept away from the interests of the private sector. And also Chalmers Johnson talks, for example, in the case of Japan, a bit about the recruitment for bureaucracy there and how that was sort of extremely well done, and how the bureaucracy was professional there. So there is a literature pointing out to certain features of the state enabling a very, very capable bureaucracy to carry out these policies. And of course, conditions in other countries, and I think the question mentioned African countries in particular are different. I would say things are very different between African countries as well in terms of their political economy and also political institutional capability to carry out certain policies. I would direct you maybe to one chapter I did on the concept of a developmental state in Ethiopia in the Oxford Handbook of the Ethiopian Economy, where I and together with Hajun Chang, we sort of compare this concept of the East Asian developmental state with the African developmental state and show how, you know, actually in East Asia, there were also influence from party politics in, for example, Taiwan, just like there is in African countries in Ethiopia, but also that there are also aspects of developmental states and also East Asian conditions, if you will, in certain African countries too. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a very big question, and feel free, other panelists, to chip in here.
Before panelists, if you can keep down some of the general comments you want to make in response to other questions, you'll get a chance to have a more fluid discussion. But I just want to make sure that we let the audience's questions be answered first. So this is also by Sebastian to the panel. What do you think a country with a tiny domestic market and a long distance to the next seaport, such as Rwanda, can do? And I also wanted to add in on this as chair, some related issues which came up, which is to be as the examples that you gave for optimism, we're also developing countries with some of the largest domestic markets in the world, right? China and Brazil. And this links, Justin, to a point you made. I've had the privilege to read your paper and some other work like Chu on automobile sector in China more recently in the 2000s, where China and large domestic markets are able to use access to their domestic market as a way to leverage local content and technology spillover demands from FDI. And there's kind of a building consensus that we know in the contemporary global context, as you ended with, Jostein, foreign firms don't need to pursue local content and aren't driven into joint ventures as they have been in previous historical periods. So yes, we know that countries with large domestic markets like China and Brazil can use domestic market access as a way to leverage or to put demands on FDI. But can other countries do this? So it's kind of linked to this, you know, developing countries with small domestic markets, what kind of policy tools can they use? And to pick up on the second point about countries that don't have access to seaports, it's very interesting in a review of countries participating in the apparel global value chain that I did. I think there's only one country besides Ethiopia that doesn't have access to a seaport. So if you look at Southeast Asia, I think it's only Laos that doesn't have access to seaports. So there is this issue, I think, you know, and Ethiopia also has struggled with access to a seaport. So these are kind of two different questions, but trying to group some questions together, and we'll let the panel answer. We'll go from Jostein, then Tobias, then Michael. You can also throw in some other points that have come up since then.
Yeah, let me quickly just build on Tobias' great great comments on sequencing of ISI and EOI, if I was not mistaken, right?
Mm.
That's what Tobias talked about. So first of all, we talked a bit about Gereffi, and I just wanted to bring out a book, Global Value Chains and Development, where Gereffi has sort of compiled a lot of his work on global value chains and development. And one of the things that is not so obvious is the intellectual roots, or where this comes from, this whole global value chain analysis. He has a chapter 1 in the book, where he goes through his journey of studying global value chains, the intellectual roots, its connections to world systems theory, its connections to dependency theory, its connection to the field of management studies. I really enjoyed reading that. That was something I had been missing for a long time, studying the global value chain literature, the intellectual roots of this literature. The chapter 1 in this book, which is a collection of a lot of Gereffi's work, is really interesting in that respect. Just on the point of sequencing, there is actually a good question by Nikolai. There is actually somewhat of a recognition, both in the global value chain literature and also in what I call the developmentalist literature, for example, by Robert Wade, that early on in the 50s and the 60s, protectionist policies were more important, and then gradually they faded away a bit and gave way for more clear, tangible, export-oriented industrialization policies. However, I would contend, like Tobias, that there was a dualism. Non-tariff barriers were quite prominent throughout the 60s and 70s as well. But throughout all these streams of literature, there is a recognition of somewhat of a more importance of ISI and early industrialization experiences in East Asia, and then that gradually the protectionist barriers gradually fading away over time. I think I'll leave it to other panelists to answer questions.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just...
Oh, I think we're losing you a little bit. Yeah, before you come in, Tobias, I want to post this one so you guys can also just comment on it as we go. Is there a general question? Oh, no, I think it's me. Just a general question. So in your comments, you guys can consider this one as well.
Yeah, I will maybe take that briefly, and then also on the point before with the smaller countries. Yeah, the neoliberal ideology. When I started doing the literature review, I thought about doing it in a way that rejecting how the World Bank and others in the beginning actually told the story of the East Asian miracle, which was very much focusing on export orientation, and then, if that's what you mean by neoliberal ideology, really focusing on these issues alone. But I think, as the summary of the literature shows, we've actually moved beyond that, and are now discussing. And actually, if you look at the literature from the 1990s, the one by Gereffi, for example, it's very nuanced and very nuanced analysis of what actually happened. And if we use that literature now to analyze policy options in a world of global value chains, I think we can at least define a baseline from where to discuss, and then that is the thread throughout more recent industrial policy papers. For example, the one by Antonio Andreoni and Hajun Chang that came out this year earlier, that actually people are saying now there's a time to talk about industrial policy again. And I would agree with that. So to the question on smaller markets, I think that is really relevant. I mean, I have worked in Botswana, and what are the options for a country like Botswana, apart from diamonds, to develop, to industrialize? It's really difficult, especially if then you get all these imports from a neighboring big country like South Africa. On the specific case of Rwanda, there's an interesting paper by Pritesh Behuria where he is actually discussing, I hear myself twice all the time, where he's actually discussing what the options are in terms of import substitution, industrialization for a small country like Rwanda. That could be quite helpful. And also, just looking at regional value chains. What are the options in regional value chains if the domestic market is really small? And it doesn't always have to be a disadvantage if the domestic market is small, because it also can push you more towards exporting earlier. So you don't always go for this default option of we can do everything alone, let's just block imports out.
Okay.
Great. You done?
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to come in on this set of questions before we take a few more?
Okay. Yeah. Just on the question of smaller markets, let's not forget that Rwanda is part of the East African community, and there's currently a continental free trade negotiation for a continental free trade going on, which would bring the market to almost 1 billion. So obviously there's scope for Rwanda to export to the region. It's just that currently there are so many problems with the current structure of regional integration in Africa that I think is even limiting industrial policy in so many ways, which has not been studied, in my opinion. So if there is a way to bring in production into regional integration in Africa, then I think the question of smaller markets would have been solved. Then I just want to touch on what Toby has said about anti-export bias in Nigeria. This is true. In cement, from the beginning, there was anti-export bias. But the moment Nigeria became self-sufficient in cement production, it became export bias, pro-export bias. Nigeria is currently lobbying with, they actually created a little ministry to lobby with other African countries for Nigeria exportation of cement. So it's not as if the anti-export bias it's still in existence now. It lasted to 2012, 2013. It became a pro-export bias. So there's a very classical understanding of industrial policy here, which is you first of all deal with domestic markets before you deal with the international, which is what I was trying to bring out with my two-step conception of industrial policy. You deal with domestic first, and then you deal with the international. So it's classic infant industry protection. You protect the infant industry, get to a certain point, then you move to international markets.
Yeah, but Michael, can I just push you on that?
Yes.
Because you did add the caveat in your presentation, which is not necessarily there in the paper, in the article, that this may apply to some sectors and not others. And so can you elaborate on what would be the characteristics of sectors in which it would apply to? I mean, I have some kind of ideas, but we know in other sectors, there's a clear difference that those firms that emerge to produce for the domestic market simply do not have the capabilities that are required to compete in global value chains, where the chain is much longer than cement and much more complex. And a completely different set of skills is required. It's not about just improving quality. So might it be something about, primary natural resource processing industries or capital intensive industries or short global value chains or the nature of lead firms in the global value chains? I mean, I think if you want to take this research further, it would be good to specify the characteristics of sectors in which your proposal would work and the characteristics of sectors in which it simply won't work.
Yes, I think that is a very, very good question. If you study most of the case studies on global value chain, they usually focus on certain sectors, textile, apparel, and I think perhaps these are the sectors that are suitable for GVC in so many ways. But they use a very neutral language to discuss industrial policy as if they are discussing all sectors. So I think the main research question would be how to distinguish the kind of sectors where global value chain oriented industrial policy would be relevant from the beginning, and the kind of sectors where ISI would also be relevant. I think the main problem with the debate is just the neutral language of traditional industrial policy is no longer relevant. And yes, part of my future research ought to be to distinguish between these different sectors from the African perspective, in order to distinguish between the sectors that should follow one path and the ones that should follow a different path. But I think domestic markets, the availability of raw material as well as domestic market, I think would come into that. There's raw material for cement production, and Nigeria is one of the biggest one of the biggest consumers of cement in Africa. So obviously there's the market and the raw material there.
Yeah, and just to follow up and link it to Justin's presentation, and then Justin, I'll give you the floor, but now I'm just trying to get, because there aren't so many questions left, a debate between us, and I've read all of your work, so as the chair, I'm going to try to mediate. I mean, one of the important points that comes out of Justin's work reviewing the literature, which is not GVC specific, but actually historical lessons, is that participating in export markets is crucial for local firm level learning. And actually, Kun Lee, the biggest South Korean academic, writing on this from a Schumpeterian point of view, has made this point over and over again. And while he recognizes the limitations to GVC-based industrialization or VSI, whatever we want to call it, he proposes this in-out model, very similar to Jung's strategic coupling, decoupling, recoupling, that you actually need to enter global value chains for local firms to learn, because there's no other way to access the tacit knowledge required in international markets than to engage with foreign buyers and foreign supplier firms. Then you may need to decouple, as Henry Jung says, or Kun Lee, out, in order to engage in certain functional upgrading or building capabilities like design and marketing, which we see in apparel, and then re-engage as a lead firm, which is a little bit like you said. But the point I want to say, to emphasize, is that this idea of needing to engage in global value chains in order to learn. And Jostein's articles, or two articles he's published lately, emphasize the point that engaging with global buyers, particularly Japanese buyers, engaging with foreign firms, often Japanese, but also US firms that set up factories in Korea and South Korea and Taiwan, through local content, through supplying intermediate inputs, or through joint ventures, or some other mini partnerships. We have tons of stories, Bangladesh, others, where local firms learn through foreign supplier firms. So if we take that to be the case, how do you see that relating to your argument, Michael? Because obviously then go to learn. So is this again something specific about sectors, where it's more complex production processes, or export markets that are highly governed in the GVC language, where lead firms really learn the requirements and the specifications. And so it's not really just learning how to produce in the old way, but actually how to network with suppliers, network with buyers. And maybe, I mean, in cement, you don't need to do that. So I just want to put that on the table also for the whole panel. Maybe we'll go back to Justin and Michael. I'll come back to you towards the end to think about that. And also, Justin, this last question from Nikolai was posed. So we only have 10 minutes left, so we'll just take a sort of last round on the panel. And also, if anyone in the audience has thought of a new question you want to pose, or actually you just want to make a comment, you can come to the stage and replace in my place. So just raise your hand or send me a question if you'd like to come to the podium. Justin.
Okay. I'll just go straight to Nikolai's question. Nikolai can also feel free to come to the stage if he wants to.
He didn't want to, but I'll ask him again.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll just answer it. That's a very good point about size of domestic markets and also the viability of developing state-owned enterprises. And actually, yeah, if you think about the countries that are sort of the catch-up experiences, the developing countries that are most well-known today for using state-owned enterprises in the process of economic development, these are with large domestic markets like China and like Brazil. However, well, Singapore is an exception in that respect, which has a small domestic market, but a high degree of state-owned ownership in the economy and state-owned enterprises. Taiwan used to be the country that was most well known in the post-World War II era for hosting a large SOE sector. But yet, generally, it might be a strategy more viable for countries with large domestic markets. There's another point from Lindsay that's an interesting point about how firms learn in connection with GVCs. And just to sort of provoke a thought experiment here, there are, should we abandon this thinking that domestic firms can learn about foreign technology and accumulate capital outside of global value chains? Is that outdated or not? I don't have the answer, but I think it's interesting to look at South Korea's policies for technology licensing on imported technologies, also the use of reverse engineering on imported inputs as a way of learning about technology. Is there anything to pick up from that experience today, or should catch-up industrialization today solely focus on connecting to global value chains? The last point I wanted to make was on neoliberalism and the role of neoliberalism in industrialization. I think we have to distinguish a bit between industrialization on the one hand and industrial policy on the other hand, right? Institutions like the World Bank are very supportive of the idea of industrialization in developing countries. We can, of course, talk about if they actually support it through the lens of unequal trade patterns and with the current climate of trade agreements, etc. But there is, I would say, strong support across the ideological spectrum for the idea of industrialization today. Industrial policy is the most contentious thing because that's specifically about the role of the state in industrialization. And as Tobias mentioned, there has been a larger degree of acceptance of industrial policy nowadays. Although it definitely goes against the tenets of neoliberalism because it's essentially picking winners. Some people say industrial policy is not about picking winners. I would contend it's part of the definition, but I'm not going to go into a very sort of long debate on exactly what is industrial policy. So yeah, that's it.
Tobias, 1 minute.
Yes.
Pick up the questions or pose your own questions or however you want.
Yeah, I mean, I can pick up on your point that learning matters, and therefore you have to associate yourself with global value chains in the first place. But I would like to emphasize that it probably depends on the level of development you're at. So it's a very different discussion if you're talking about Ethiopia in the last 5 years, and then if you look, for example, at South Africa, where you have a developed industry, where the issue is not getting the capabilities and getting the technology into the country, but basically reclaiming the industry for domestic ownership. So I think that is also something like today we have not gone very far in terms of policy advice maybe, but that was also probably not the purpose. It's more about a baseline understanding of what are the old policies, are they still relevant? And then when it comes to the actual policy advice, it's really important to distinguish between countries, their level of development, and also to have nuanced studies of different global value chains. And then to look at what are the effects on ownership, what are the possibilities for domestic integration, maybe as Justin said, trying to do that outside of global value chains wherever possible. And then think about value capture, like how can you actually get this traditional surplus from exporting that is so essential? And I think without these nuanced studies, just going back to these broad claims is not helpful. So if you emphasize only go into GVCs and upgrade is not helpful, but also this counter reaction that is prominent in just saying, okay, let's look inward then, because there are no options in global value chains. But that is the counter reaction to the 1980s, 1990s debate on industrial policy, and that is also very misleading and inspired by the Nigerian discussion, I got into this kind of thinking in the beginning. And I think it's important to establish this baseline understanding that we need both for industrialization.
Yeah, I know Antonio's in the audience as well, but I would just want to push you a little on that. I think we can all agree with what you said. So if we try to move further and thinking about the automobile sector and thinking about South Africa's experience versus China's experience and the papers, that we have read, that leveraging knowledge through FDI, through joint ventures with state-owned enterprises, but not only, the new local private enterprises that emerged and actually had a lot of support from Taiwan and South Korea expertise, then use that to develop their own brands for the domestic market that then could compete with foreign firms also supplying the domestic market. So, I mean, what can you learn from that could maybe apply to South Africa? If South Africa's if they're in the out stage, but if we can move beyond simple statements to say, what does that mean? And but can we really get beyond the need to leverage knowledge from foreign firms initially? Have South African, firms done that now? Could they go out, or are they still not learned enough to increase their quality, or are they just competed out of the market before they could even learn? I know it's a big question. We only have 1 minute left, so if you just give a short answer. So I was going to give the floor back to Michael, but I see we've lost him for a second. So just a quick response to that while I see if we can find Michael.
Yeah, I mean, comparing the Chinese experience, and there's also literature arguing that maybe the Chinese experience in the automotive industry was also not that successful. So even with this big domestic market, it was very difficult to capture shares of that market for domestic firms. So, I mean, and that what is then the option for South Africa in a market of 600,000 cars, or even domestically only 400,000 cars? So, and are you going to compete then against Volkswagen? So, I think that's a very tough question, and that's a very tough question, and it's important to understand what also went wrong in terms of the industrial policy. And the political economy behind that. Why was it? Because maybe the chance is already over. So how are you going to reclaim that? The only option to reclaim shares of the domestic market now is just to increase local content, is to produce more cars, larger values also for exporting, and then give a share of that to domestic firms. But through this industrial policy that was implemented, the chance to get more domestic firms into learning and link up with as suppliers with the multinationals, it's kind of lost, I would say.
Okay. So that's something to ponder. Maybe in the next section we can pick it up again. Can opportunities really be lost? I'm not sure. But Michael, 30 seconds last, or maybe I'll give you a bit more, but I want to let you come in. Final comment.
Yeah, one, I was just going to touch on this idea of strategic coupling, decoupling, and recoupling. That's the in, out, and in again. I think once you're in, sometimes it's very difficult to get out. I'm currently studying cocoa production in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. I'm studying from a very broad perspective. It's very obvious to me that these countries are not benefiting from cocoa farming, but it is very difficult for them to stop producing cocoa because it's now something else. There is now a culture, and because of the marketing board, cocoa is one of the main source of income, and so on and so forth. So once you're in, it's usually difficult to get out. So it might be better to just go through the ISI before you couple, if that makes any sense. And I also think this idea that GVC is the only way of learning for domestic firm, we have to trouble this. Because just to go back to the Dangote case, Dangote imported technical assistance from abroad. I mean, that was not direct GVC. We then had to train domestic workers, domestic technicians. That's not classical GVC, but there are so many ways of learning without going through GVC. I'm not saying this should apply to all sectors. So the main research question ought to be how to separate out these sectors. The sectors for which GVC is the only way out. The sectors for which some level of ISI would be required, and so on and so forth. I also want to touch on the idea of state-owned enterprise. That's Justin's idea. I think this would be very difficult in some contexts. In some African countries, certainly in the western part of Africa, the idea of Nigeria government owning an enterprise, that is not even possible. I mean, it would be it would be just a channel for siphoning money. So I think that is very difficult to imagine in a country like Nigeria. Even in Ghana, although they do have some state-owned enterprises in Ghana, and we do in Nigeria even, but they are. I don't see this as the way out in if we're discussing specific countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and even Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're out of time. I just follow it just to summarize or pull together some key points. I think that in addition to going beyond EOI and ISI, we also need to start talking about specific GVCs. I think what I'm hearing is that it's not useful to say things that apply to all sectors. So I see a lot of differences about primary commodity processing sectors, so agriculture-based processing or natural resource-based processing is very different than manufacturing. And then the panel this afternoon will also have digital economy, digital services. But even within manufacturing, Tobias and I always talk that apparel is very different than automobiles. So I think another way to move this conversation forward is to start using less general statements and being much more specific. I should also say that I was supposed to have a paper on this, but I couldn't be administrative and have a paper. But my paper on industrial policy and Ethiopia's apparel export industry is available. If anyone wants it, you can just email me and I can send it to you. So we've run out of time, just 5 minutes over. We do have another panel this afternoon starting at 2. We have 4 papers and they will very much pick up on the conversation started in this panel and continue them. So I hope that you will join us again then. And thank you very much for coming, and we'll give a virtual round of applause to the paper presenters for today. I don't know how this works in virtual reality. But yeah, that's all from this side.
Lindsay, remind me, what time is the next panel? It's
UK 2 o'clock.
2.
So there is, I think, a plenary speaker in the break. So lunch, I think, and then the plenary speaker, and then the panel start again 2 to 3:45 UK time. And we have Antonio Andrioni and his paper, Florian and Carlos Oya, Stephanie Kunkel, and Christopher Foster presenting. So we will see you then. And thank you, Michael, Tobias, and Jostein.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.